Well, we have an interesting situation in the United States, one that has to be looked at soberly for what it is, but also has to be looked at for how it came to be. What we're going to do is to give you a way of thinking about what has happened to the American presidency. Now, to do this requires an arc of 60 years because the process that happened over that period of time. So what you're seeing now with respect to the inability of the American people to get on top of what is happening or to affect what is happening. Apparently, no matter what you do, you can't get an outcome better. It gets worse and worse. There are reasons for that. And it's hard to understand if you don't have a sense of what actually was done. Now, we're going to do this by means of a set of video references, because it's easier by watching it to get a sense of it than by talking about it. The first one, which is just a short, if we have it, is a presentation. It's just a discussion that happened between Judge Napolitano and Larry Johnson. Those of you who are regularly involved with our Thursday evening fireside chat know that Larry was on a couple weeks ago and had a discussion with us. Johnson is a former specialist with Central Intelligence Agency, and he was being interviewed by Napolitano, but there was a very particular moment that they wanted to discuss, and it had to do with Victorian Newland. So we're going to try to show that first. A couple minutes of that.
You may be a little tired of watching Victorian Newland, but just last Friday, here's what she had to say about the spring offensive. Now, remember, the number 3 person in the State Department, but also the major domo of all political decisions with respect, and maybe military, I don't know, with respect to Ukraine. Take a listen.
And even as you plan for the counteroffensive, which we have been working on with you for some 4 or 5 months, we are already beginning our discussions with the Ukrainian government and with friends in Kyiv, both in the civilian side and on the military side, about Ukraine's long-term future.
All right, two things to unpack there. The American government has been working closely and carefully with the government in Kyiv on the spring offensive, and she's stating this in a public venue?
Yeah.
What kind of sense does that make, whether it's true or not?
No, it's crazy. Of course, General Newland, we remember, was she a graduate of West Point, or was it the Naval Academy or Air Force Academy? No, she was a graduate of no military academy, no military experience.
She was at Princeton. She was an undergraduate at Princeton with General Milley, same time period. I don't know if they knew each other. They were there at the same time period. This is a generation at Princeton after Sam Alito and I were there.
yeah. So what this is a reminder, she is completely inexperienced on that front. But the problem is she thinks she knows what she's talking about. She does have information in terms of what the level of U.S. support is to
that's
Ukraine.
Good. All right. So that's actually true. There's an actual situation in which someone with no military experience whatsoever is in a position of asserting publicly actions that merit a response from the government of Russia, which would be equivalent to beginning World War III, were they to simply act. Now, the next excerpt we're going to show you is Kennedy, October 22nd of 1962, discussing the motivation for why the United States would be prepared to launch thermonuclear weapons against the Soviet Union.
Nevertheless, American citizens have become adjusted to living daily on the bullseye of Soviet missiles located inside the USSR or in submarines. In that sense, missiles in Cuba add to an already clear and present danger. Although it should be noted, the nations of Latin America have never previously been subjected to a potential nuclear threat. But this secret, swift, extraordinary buildup of communist missiles in an area well known to have a special and historical relationship to the United States and the nations of the Western Hemisphere, in violation of Soviet assurances and in defiance of American and hemispheric policy, this sudden, clandestine decision to station strategic weapons for the first time outside of Soviet soil is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which cannot be accepted by this country if our courage and our commitments are ever to be trusted again by either friend or foe.
Now, those missiles were 90 miles away from the United States. The circumstance of Ukraine and the Ukraine war, besides the number of promises broken by NATO and by the United States over a 30-year period, besides the ignoring of warning after warning by that Russian government, that circumstance of the placement of launchers, particularly in Poland and Romania, and the present circumstance now of the launching of drone attacks on Moscow and the seat of government, the Kremlin, goes substantially beyond the conditions that Kennedy referenced in this short video. Now, everyone knows that Lyndon LaRouche, who founded the organization and the philosophical outlook and tendency that all of us here are associated with, had some things to say about the presidency. He ran for president 8 times, and we've previously referenced his evaluation of the issue of the Kennedy assassination. And we're going to interpolate it here, put it in here, to remind you of something which Lyndon LaRouche thought, which was different than the normal assessments of the Kennedy assassination.
Welcome to the International Connection. Today we continue our conversation with Lyndon LaRouche from his jail cell in Alexandria, Virginia.
The point is, was Kennedy killed because he was John F. Kennedy, or was President Kennedy killed because he was president?
That's the problem.
And that's right, and I lean to the second one.
Because he was the president.
That's right. He happened to have the misfortune of being the president at the time, which is the primary reason for it.
So there were forces. I mean, Kennedy even said there was a government behind his back. There was this group behind him that was orchestrating a lot of these crises.
It was essentially, it's not unknown who they are.
Well, the Rockefellers, would they be part of them?
I think the Rockefellers, that's where I would get off Peter a bit on, with my own view, is that I think that's exaggerated. Yes, the Rockefeller interest is very specific. I know the thing. I've done a lot in exposing it. David Rockefeller is certainly no friend of mine.
Yes.
But I think that misses the point because it makes it too narrow and makes it too linear.
Right. In other words, it's the idea of the Fondi. It's a group of associates.
There's a social formation to the effect that no one individual or no one individual group determines the group. It's the inner within the group that determines what the group does.
Right, and that's why they can't put the finger on who killed Kennedy, those kind of things. They can't.
More than that, I think it's the problem is more than that. When you organize an assassination of that type for the President of the United States, a conspiracy which operated on the scale of which that thing operated. Remember, the killing of Kennedy enveloped and overlay efforts to assassinate Charles de Gaulle.
Yes.
The same operation, in effect.
Yep.
So it's a vast conspiracy. Now, when you get a vast conspiracy, what makes the conspiracy work is a lot of deception within the conspiracy and a lot of exploitation of the particular motivation of people who are drawn into playing particular roles. So that if you interrogate somebody and say who pulled the trigger and say, why was the President of the United States killed? Why'd you shoot him? This fellow might have a motive. He might simply say, because I was paid to do so.
Yes.
Or somebody else might explain a motive. That might have been the motive for their behavior or the induced motive. That doesn't mean that's why the thing happened. So that it comes to a question, the people who planned this, and this was, I don't think I should name it on the air,
yes,
but the people who planned this were functioning at a very high level. So they knew what they were doing, unlike people on a lower level who may not have known fully what they were doing, apart from the killing. And even some didn't know they were involved in the killing.
Say that again?
They knew that they were destabilizing the institution of the Presidency of the United States.
You just said those people in the low levels didn't know what they were...
They didn't know the full implications of what
they were doing.
They knew what they were doing, but they didn't know what somebody else intended this to lead to.
Yes.
And what they were doing was destabilizing, particularly with a cover-up, the Warren Commission cover-up. The combination of the assassination with the cover-up actually did destabilize the United States, destabilize the institutions of government of the United States, destroyed the presidency as an efficient instrument of government, as a constitutional instrument. And the fellows who organized this thing at that level knew they were doing this. So therefore, I say, if they weren't out to kill Kennedy, though somebody may have come up with motives for killing John F. Kennedy, they were out to kill President Kennedy because he was president.
The institution.
The institution.
So I want to make a point here about what Lynn just said with respect to the destabilization of the United States by the cover-up, because that is the clear and present and persistent and abiding condition of this country. You cannot straighten out. You will never straighten out the United States. You will do nothing to straighten out the United States successfully if you cannot unravel and expose in full, lurid detail every element of the cover-up of the Kennedy assassination. And the reason for that is that the apparatus and the processes that carried that out are the apparatus and the process that ruled you now. So there's no way to do anything that will be productive. You can't reverse what would seem to be very straightforward policies, because there's an apparatus that is governing, which is never admitted to be that which is governing. And it's not a matter of it being, quote, simply secret. It's not that. It's the fact that the people don't have the courage, or are not led by people who have the courage, to actually allow the people to govern themselves. That is our circumstance. Now, Kennedy gave a speech which we are going to be commemorating next week, June 10th of 1963. And this was a speech in which he sought to begin a process of changing the relationship of the United States to thermonuclear war and to the Soviet Union. We want to play a brief excerpt from that speech, and I want to reference the fact that that speech was given one day before another speech, and we'll see that excerpt as well. They're actually the same speech, but they're not the same in focus or emphasis. And so this speech at American University is sometimes called by people the most important speech that John Kennedy gave. One can evaluate that differently, but we want to play a short excerpt from that for you now.
I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth, peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
The next day, Kennedy gave a speech in response to the then very recent events in Birmingham, Alabama, where the Reverend James Bevel, who would later be vice presidential candidate with Lyndon LaRouche, had violated the protocol of the other members of the civil rights movement at the point that Dr. King was in jail, and he had created a process which became known as the Children's March. He had children as young as 8 years old out in the streets, and he had deployed them, about 2,000 of them, and this had resulted in mayhem of a merry type in Birmingham, which has now become iconic whenever you are seeing the pictures of the water hoses and the dogs and the people being bitten and all that. It's all from the same march. It's all from the action that Reverend James Bevel organized at that time. As I said, later he would be the vice presidential candidate with Lyndon LaRouche when Lyndon LaRouche was in jail at the time of the earlier 1992 that was. But the speech that Kennedy gave the next day, we have a short excerpt from. It was a Civil Rights Act speech, as it became known. And we just want to play a minute of that as well.
In a time of domestic crisis, men of goodwill and generosity should be able to unite regardless of party or politics. This is not even a legal or legislative issue alone. It is better to settle these matters in the courts than on the streets, and new laws are needed at every level. But law alone cannot make men see right. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay?
Now, in order to just give an idea about how Kennedy shifted and how radical his shifts were in this period, including here, by the way, and that's a story about that we can tell at some other point, because the March on Washington was called against Kennedy and his brother. And it was called by Reverend James Bevel, again, as I said, sometimes quite out of the box, which is why Lyndon LaRouche recruited him to run for vice president, I might add. But Kennedy could be changed quickly, and he would change his judgments. And we're going to play now as an excerpt from an internal discussion about the space program. Now, this one involves 3 characters. You'll hear it. You may have to read it, and it's an argument. And Kennedy is telling them that getting to the moon is the #1 priority of his space program because we must beat the Russians. But this is just a setup.
You put this program, I think this program is the top priority program of the agency?
No, sir, I do not. I think it is one of the top priority programs, but I think it's very important to recognize here that as you have found what you could do with the rocket, as you found how you could get out beyond the Earth's atmosphere and into space and make measurements, several scientific disciplines that are very powerful have begun to converge on this area.
Jim, I think it is the top priority. I think we ought to have that very clear. Some of these other programs can slip 6 months or 9 months, and nothing particularly is going to happen. It's going to make it. But this is important for political reasons, international political reasons, and for this is, whether we like it or not, in a sense, a race. If we get second to the moon, it's nice, but it's like being second anytime. So that if we're second by 6 months, because we didn't give it the kind of priority, then of course that'd be very serious. So I think we have to take the view this is the top priority.
Number one, there are real unknowns as to whether man can live under the weightless condition and you will ever make the lunar landing. This is one kind of political vulnerability I'd like to avoid such a flat commitment to.
I agree that we're interested in, but we can wait 6 months.
But you have to use that information to do your thing.
Yeah, but only when that information directly applies to the program. Jim, I think we got to have that.
Mr. President.
We don't know a damn thing about the surface of the moon, and we're making the wildest guesses about how we're going to land on the moon. And we could get a terrible disaster from putting something down on the surface of the moon that's very different than we think it is. And the scientific programs that find us that information have to have the highest priority, but they are associated with the lunar program. The scientific programs that aren't associated with the lunar program can have any priority we please to give them. Now, the other thing is, I would certainly not favor spending $6 to $7 billion to find out about space. Why are we spending $7 billion in getting fresh water from salt water when we're spending $7 billion to find out about space? But so obviously you wouldn't put it on that priority except for the defense implications. And the second point is the fact that the Soviet Union has made this a test of the system. So that's why we're doing it. So I think we've got to take the view that this is the key program, and the rest of it, we can find out about it, but there's a lot of things we want to find out about.
But you see,
Cancer and everything else.
when you talk about this, it's very hard to draw a line between what
I think everything that we do ought to really be tied in to getting onto the moon and ahead of the Russians.
Why can't it be tied to preeminence in space, which are your own words?
Because, by God, we've been telling everybody we're preeminent in space. For 5 years, nobody believes it because they have the booster and the satellite. But I do think we ought to get it, really clear that the policy ought to be that this is the top priority program of the agency and one of the two, except for defense, the top priority of the United States government. I think that's the position we ought to take. Now, this may not change anything about that schedule, but at least we ought to be clear. Otherwise, we shouldn't be spending this kind of money because I'm not that interested in space. I think it's good. I think we ought to know about it. We're ready to spend reasonable amounts of money, but we're talking about these fantastic expenditures which wreck our budget and all these other domestic programs. And the only justification for it, in my opinion, to do it is because we hope to beat them and demonstrate that starting behind as we did by a couple of years, by God, we passed them.
All right. Now that's Kennedy. Okay, so for all those who would like to create that magnificent image of he's just interested in space, just interested in, no, there was something else. That was November of '62, right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I'm going to read to you now, we don't have the excerpt at the moment, from September of '63, his speech at the United Nations. So in other words, this is less than a year later. And he said this: finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity, in the field of space, there is room for new cooperation, for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space. I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon. Space offers no problems of sovereignty. By resolution of this assembly, the members of the United Nations have forsworn any claim to territorial rights in outer space or on celestial bodies, and declared that international law and the United Nations Charter will apply. Why, therefore, should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Why should the United States and the Soviet Union, in preparing for such expeditions, become involved in immense duplications of research, construction, and expenditure? Surely we should explore whether the scientists and astronauts of our two countries, indeed of all of the world, cannot work together in the conquest of space, sending someday in this decade to the moon not the representatives of a single nation, but the representatives of all of our countries. So again, now just to conclude, what we're dealing with is a real person undergoing real transformation in response to real challenges. And that process of change, of development, of transformation was what moved the United States and its people forward as well. The fact that this was seen in the case of the Civil Rights speech which as I mentioned, we saw this once before. I remember seeing the speech when I was 10 years old. And Birmingham was where my parents were from. So when these kids were in the street in Birmingham playing in the water hoses and so on, this was something my parents talked about. We all talked about it. We knew people from Birmingham, but we weren't there. We were very happy to not be there, actually. But it's important just to see that the transformations that he represented for people directly because of his own commitment to change are an important element to the personality. We have a final video clip we want to show here now. I believe, I don't know if I believe this is the last one, which is Kennedy discussing on November 4th in a private memo that he's making. And you'll hear him every once in a while, he'll say comma or period. You'll hear him saying this because he's using a dictation machine to talk about a coup that has just happened in Vietnam, where the United States, after a period of deliberation around October 29th, 30th, had decided to remove from office Diem of Vietnam. Diem had been President Diem had been there from just after 1954. That's a longer history. We don't want to go through it. We're playing this excerpt because this is 3 weeks before Kennedy is assassinated. The apparatus that will assassinate him is already afoot. And what you're going to be hearing and you're going to be seeing, you want to watch the screen carefully, again, it will have the subtitles, is he is describing the dispute about the coup. Kennedy did not want to carry out the coup, as did Robert Kennedy not want to carry out the coup, and also some other people like Maxwell Taylor, Robert McNamara, and others were opposed. But on the ground was Henry Cabot Lodge. And also in favor of the coup was Averell Harriman and various other people from the Department of State who, unbeknownst to Kennedy, had essentially decided that Diem was going to go and in a rather, shall we say, unceremonious way. They would assassinate him. This, of course, has some relevance to today. And so we're going to show you this, and you're going to notice something that happens in the middle of this. Kennedy's interrupted. Let's show that.
Monday, November 4th, 1963. Over the weekend, the coup in Saigon took place. Culminated 3 months of conversation about a coup, conversation which divided the government here and in Saigon. Opposed to a coup was General Taylor, the Attorney General, Secretary McNamara, to a somewhat less degree, John McCone, partly because of an old hostility to Lodge, which causes him to lack confidence in Lodge's judgment, partly as a result of a new hostility, because Lodge shifted his station chief, in favor of the coup was State, led by Averell Harriman, George Ball, Roger Hillsman, supported by Mike Forrestal at the White House. I feel that we must bear a good deal of responsibility for it, beginning with our cable of early August, in which we suggested the coup. Period, in my judgment, that wire was badly drafted. It should never have been sent on a Saturday. I should not have given my consent to it without a roundtable conference in which McNamara and Taylor could have presented their views. While we did redress that balance in later wires, that first wire encouraged Lodge along a course to which he was, in any case, inclined. Hawkins continued to oppose the coup on the ground that the military effort was doing well. There was a sharp split between Saigon and the rest of the country. Politically, the situation was deteriorating. Militarily, it had not had its effect. There was a feeling, however, that it would. For this reason, Secretary McNamara and General Taylor supported applying additional pressures to Diem and New in order to move them.
Hello. Naughty, naughty.
Why do the leaves fall? And why does the snow come on the ground?
Because
Why do the leaves turn green? Spring. And where do we go to Cape Ann-Port? It's summer.
And then you're going to.
I was shocked by the death of Zim and knew. I'd met Zim with Justice Douglas many years ago. He was an extraordinary character. While he became increasingly difficult in the last months, nevertheless, over a 10-year period, he'd held his country together, maintained its independence under very adverse conditions. The way he was killed made it particularly abhorrent. The question now is whether the generals can stay together and build a stable government, or whether Saigon will turn on public opinion in Saigon, the intellectuals, students, etc., will turn on this government as repressive and undemocratic in the not-too-distant future.
So, we know what happened in Vietnam. We don't know what happened in the Kennedy assassination, though some of us think we know well some elements of it. But what you just saw in the interruption of the president is sort of the way of thinking about the American people at the time. John Kennedy Jr. sort of represented the naivete, the innocence, and the love of the president of many people at that time. Today, it is required, and this is the importance of the candidacy that Diane has offered to the country, that independent voices intervene and say, we will not rest, we will not move from this point until the ghost of that murder, the ghost of that crime is extirpated from the American people. Because if you don't do that, then the American people cannot feel free, and they cannot deliberate freely, and there can be no redress, not merely of their problems, but there can be no redress of the civilizational problem that has been caused by that assassination. Now, while Lyndon LaRouche did everything humanly possible to achieve that authority in the presidency, and once was able to exercise that through the vehicle of the presidency of President Ronald Reagan, now it is to us left the task to fulfill that mission that his life was purposed for. And it's something that is in our capacity. It's in this room, and it's in rooms like it around the United States to accomplish. As Kennedy said, man can be as big as he wants. There is no problem that human beings have caused that cannot be solved. And there is every reason to be confident that the candidacy that Diane represents, which is, yes, a Senate candidacy, but it is more than that. It is an independent candidacy in America at a time when people are afraid to be independent, courageous, and truthful. Now, that's what Lynn wanted from his collaborators, his organization, and his nation. That's what she is providing. And I think it's important for us to therefore think here today, how can the rest of us step up to that challenge, but recognize at the same time the joy of doing it in the voice and the naivete and innocence of John F. Kennedy Jr. That's us. But that's how we were. How we have to be is what Diane's candidacy represents. Thank you.